welcome to Healthcast number 3. So in this Healthcast, I'm going to be talking about physiotherapists, exercise physiologists, and probably more broadly the medical community in general, and why and where I fit into all this, because I'm not medically trained. I'm not a physio, I'm not an exercise physiologist, even though I'm very interested in all things physiology and exercise and training, and I've been doing all these things for years. But I'm not medically trained, and I'm not a doctor either. So the title of this podcast might seem then a little bit, perhaps a little bit arrogant on my part to think that I know when physios don't work, because I've had a lot of experience with physios, not through injury but through clients of mine, and I've worked with physios who have then tried to advise me how to train clients in the past and more recently, and it's something that I find just extremely annoying, I'll be honest, is how many physios work. And be careful here not to say all physios, because obviously there'll be good physios, there'll be bad physios, but I'm going to talk quite generally about the general physiotherapy profession and the exercise physiology profession as well, because I think that they're not good. And I think if for most people who are getting physiotherapy or going to see an exercise physiologist, certainly for biomechanics, for biomechanical issues, I think they're not being served particularly well. And I'm going to explain that in a bit more detail. So, firstly then, why generally I dislike the physiotherapy profession, and why and also the exercise physiology profession when it comes to training people for joint health. And obviously exercise physiologists are a bit more broad than physiotherapists, who are basically into joint, muscle, biomechanical health, whereas exercise physiologists will dabble a bit in that. I might start with exercise physiologists. So my problem with exercise physiologists is that they do very much dabble in biomechanical issues. So, for example, perhaps a good reason to go to an exercise physiologist is if you've got heart issues or circulation issues more broadly, or diabetes, or any other of these the more internal issues where you need general fitness advice, like what kind of intensity to train at, what kind of exercise would be good for you. Would it be better to do, for instance, weight training or aerobic exercise? How much of it? All these sort of things. Exercise physiologists will have a great deal more expertise than, say, someone like me, who doesn't really deal with people expressly for that reason. So that's my issue with the exercise physiologists. They're too broad in their understanding. They don't really deal with the biomechanical issues day in, day out, like maybe a physio would, or even just an ordinary trainer would do with some specialism. So they may be not very fit to deal with, like, for instance, a chronic back pain or chronic knee pain or anything like that, or neck pain or something. So my general criticism of the physios then is that the general practice doesn't really understand the ideal of how to move at a deep level. So, as I've mentioned in other podcasts, there is a way to hold yourself in a correct posture, and there is a way to move correctly as well. I won't go into all of that in this podcast. You can see my other material on that. But I find that physios are just completely ignorant of these ideals. They don't know how people should hold themselves. They don't know how people should move. They generally don't regard posture as of much importance. They don't see a link between posture and injury. A video I will do something about the link between posture and injury. It's actually very, very subtle and nuanced, that topic. But physios don't really go near it because they think, you know, you're an individual, this is the way you are, and there's no point really changing it on a deep level. We're just going to do this exercise and this exercise and just magically hope that you get better. Now, I find this a big problem. I mean, if a physio doesn't know how to move, if he doesn't know what position you should be in for a specific exercise, for example, at least the ideal, then I'm not sure how you're going to maintain any long-term benefits from exercise at all. And even then, I always, because they don't know this, often the exercises that they give people will actually be counterproductive. They'll be counter to what will actually help them. And I find that's a real problem. Often I see physios giving things like push-ups, sit-ups to people who have very rounded posture, for example, have neck pain and stuff like this. And I just wonder why they're doing it. And also stretching. They do an awful lot of stretching for people that it's just not going to do any good to whatsoever. And a lot of isolated exercises. The classic one is rotator cuff injuries. So I guarantee if anyone goes to the physio, you'll come back from the physio with this exercise to do and this exercise to do for your rotator cuff tear. Well, it's just far too simple, and it's always targeted on the area of pain and never really about fixing the system as a whole. You know, so is your problem that your rotator cuffs aren't strong enough, or is the problem that you're in such a compromised position that you're using your rotator cuffs too much in the first place to power any movement? I'd argue that it's number two, not number one. But from my experience of physios, they're just not getting into enough depth with their clients. They don't even assess, many don't even assess their posture, they don't assess their movement. And you know, as soon as you assess someone's gait, for example, their movement, you can see often, in very obvious cases, you can see where the pressure is mounting on them very, very quickly. And then it's another matter to try and change it. But at least you can identify that the problem in many cases is with people's movement, and this is especially true of chronic injury, but it can also cause some acute injuries as well. Okay, all that said then, I'm not saying that physios are never useful. So I do think that there are some occasions when they can be useful. So I find that there are two. So I'm being quite general here with two, but the first one would be for simple, everyday problems that they see on a regular basis, because they're seeing people with pain on a regular basis. There will be sometimes there'll be things that some people do out of habit that are not good for them. For example, when they're reading a book, they may tilt their heads forwards, or using their smartphone, tilt their heads forward, and that may give them some neck pain. But some people just don't see it, and then a physio who's worked for many, many years may have noticed a pattern of people with sore necks who read a lot, things like that. And it can be as simple as that to fix some people's pain issues, at least in the short term. But there are many more complicated issues of chronic pain that just never get sorted, and that's because physios, they're just not looking into enough depth. As I've previously mentioned, they're really almost solely focused on the area of pain, which is always a problem. It needs to be the focus is on the body as a whole, and what's really causing that pain. Where is the symptom? Where's it coming from? Where, you know, why are you overusing this area or overstretching this area, for example? The other thing they're useful with is for major injuries or acute injuries. So I'll tell a story about this. So last time I was in England, I play squash, so I played for my squash team back in England for just a few matches. We turned up and played a match, and while I was watching one of my teammates play someone who was a very clumsy mover, towards the end of the game, they played a shot, their opponent went the wrong way, and then dived across to pick the ball up and actually took out my friend in the process. And in the process, literally completely dislocated their ankle. They took them out so badly that his if you can imagine, this is his foot and this is his tibia. It actually completely dislocated it, so it was actually sitting almost below the foot on the floor. It was a horrendous injury. It actually caused some breaks with it as well, and yeah, it was pretty horrific. It was one of those things that you just turn your head away from. Now, fortunately, one of my other friends in the team was a physio, and he handled that situation very well, because a physio will have a much greater knowledge of injury problems, like particularly acute injury problems, than I will, for example. I know fairly well exactly what's happening at the joint. Their knowledge theoretically is much better, and they'll know risks like, for example, problems with blood supply. If you cut off the blood supply, if you've dislocated something, for example, what the issues are with the healing of ligaments. You see that these are issues I just don't know, because I'm training people to move properly. I'm not really focused on specific injuries, but because physios have that theoretical knowledge and they've dealt with people with specific injuries, they'll know how to proceed best. And perhaps a doctor would have been even better than him, a specific doctor in that kind of area of expertise, but he was a pretty good person to be at hand, because he knew what where not to move it, perhaps some of the risks that would be associated with such a bad break and dislocation, whereas I'm not going to know anything about that. And in the immediate recovery from such an injury, he would also know what not to do, some issues that could go specifically to the area of injury. And this is both the strength and the weakness of physios. They're very good at examining the area of injury, but they don't look much outside that box when you're looking long term. So in the immediate aftermath of a catastrophic injury such as that, you may want to focus on the area of injury quite closely. But then in the long term, going not just months but years into the future, what can you do to make sure that injury doesn't mess you up somewhere else in the body, or even sort of not, obviously it won't come, that sort of injury won't come back, but let's say something like a snapped Achilles tendon, for example. Is that something that could come back? I've seen a couple of people snap Achilles tendons as well, and it's possible that there was something biomechanical that led up to that snap of the Achilles tendon in the first place. That might not be just some mere accident of where you've placed your foot, or where someone's hit you, for example. That may be something biomechanical. And then if you've injured your Achilles tendon, you've recovered from it, and you come back, what are the chances you're going to do it again, because you're actually moving in exactly the same way, or moving in a very similar way to what you were before. So unless you address the way you move, how are we going to really cure that problem on a long-term basis? And that's where I think physios are supremely ignorant, to be honest. They're not really looking into that much depth. In all, of course, there are obviously going to be some that are better than others. Okay, so let's deal with that. Some of the fundamental issues with physios in a little bit more detail. So they're good for acute or catastrophic joint or bone injuries or muscle injuries, for example, in the immediate aftermath of when they happen, and maybe a few weeks down the line. After that, I think they're very limited. Now, why is that? And as I've already mentioned, there's quite a bit of ignorance in the physiotherapist field about the effect of posture, the effect of good movement and movement efficiency on injury long term, and that's my issue. So I said this was before my knowledge was quite where it was now, to my physio friend in England, about posture. So I thought posture is very important in reducing injury risk. Now I think it really is, but my friend gave me this reply. He said that posture, it has been shown that posture has no effect on injury risk. Now, according to the current data, that is in fact true. It's absolutely true. But why is that? Now, this is where I have a real issue with quality of data is the first point here. So the first point is, what is good posture? Now, not many people know that. Not many people know what good posture is. They don't know how to get themselves in a good postural position, which is why I have put other videos about finding a good postural position. So immediately you've got a problem with categorizing what good posture is. Now, what I think they've done when they've done the studies here is they've basically looked at people broadly. So what does their alignment look like from the side and from the front? So if from the side, for example, they're kind of like this, person A is like this, but person B is like this, well then they're going to say that person B, their posture obviously isn't as good. Fair enough. And also, they may also do things from front on as well. So person A, excuse me. So person A has this kind of front on looking posture. Person B has this kind of front on looking posture. And obviously you can tell that person B, again, doesn't have quite so good posture. So then, why aren't we, if that is the case, let's say that the formation of the data, the principles that they're basing the data on are, okay, fairly sound. What's the problem here? Well, bad posture in many ways has a protective influence on people. Now think when you were young and you had good posture, you were leaping and bounding around all over the place. Now, as the stresses and the strains are built up on your life, your body is kind of adapted by protecting these areas, and it often does it by shortening muscles and shortening, laying down fascia, which tends to create this shortening effect. A lot of people call this like adaptive muscle shortening. Cyclists often talk about adaptive muscle shortening, and runners too. And the more you cycle and the more you run, the shorter and shorter your muscles get in certain specific areas, like hip flexors, for example, in cyclists, and hamstrings over time, because they're not getting lengthened and lengthened properly during the exercise. And this happens throughout your life. So what happens then? Well, in most people, it stops them going through ranges of motion. It makes them do something like this, for example. So if you have got good posture, you may be able to really, in your gait cycle when you're running, really pump your legs and really get your torso rotating and moving properly. When you've got bad posture, you're going to be quite shuffly, like this. You're going to start shuffling, smaller steps, smaller strides, you won't be as fast, etc., etc. So this effect, the effect is that someone with poor posture often has reduced range of motion, and that reduced range of motion often stops them doing harmful things. Now, if someone, and I often find this, particularly when I first started trying to look at people's biomechanics and get them to move better, I'd often see people come who, on the surface of things, look like they have very, very decent posture. They weren't particularly rounded, or they didn't have scoliosis or anything. But then when they moved horribly, and in almost all of those cases, they moved in a very loosey-goosey way. And they didn't have this muscle shortening that other people had. They were almost the opposite. They were too flexible. They did big ranges of motion. You often see it in a squat, for example. You get someone to squat or lunge, and they're like this. They're very loosey-goosey. They'll do this massively, very, very deep squat super easily. And they'll do it really badly as well. So then the knees will be going far too far forward. They'll arch their back far too much at the bottom, for example, or the opposite, they'll round too much as well. And it just will look, it has the appearance to someone who is who appreciates good movement as something that looks really horrible and actually quite dangerous, because these people, even though their posture is okay, they haven't experienced this muscle shortening, they don't know where to stop, you could say. They have a range of motion that they can push too far, and they don't have the ability to connect their body properly to move and function very well. So what you often get, for example, is like an athlete who has maybe stretched a lot in their life, and then they come into their mid-30s and they get to their 30s and they're still able to go through these big ranges of motion to play their sport, but all of a sudden they'll start getting bad hips, they'll get knee ligament damage and all this, and they'll look fairly good posturally, but they haven't, their body has, while trying to adapt, has not been able to limit the range of motion to a safe range of motion, and they've just been able to continually go past safe ranges of motion. So bad posture in many ways protects people from going into these damaging ranges of motion, and I don't think that that's well understood in the physio world. This leads me onto gait, so how we move as human beings, really. So like a kangaroo hops, a fish swims, human beings walk and run. That's how we get around. So the limited understanding of physios and in fact doctors in this area just astounds me. I've seen so many clients that come to me, and one of the first things I'll do, obviously the first thing I do is assess their posture. The next thing I assess is their gait. And I have a couple of ways about doing this. You can just get someone to run, it's pretty obvious, or you can get them to go through a range of motion and exercise just to raise their hands as they're walking forward. It's kind of a simple exercise I do when I can't have the ability to just look at them run, or they're not really very capable of running, for example, as many people aren't. And it's so obvious. It's so obvious not in everyone, but in some people, their dysfunctions in their gait are so obvious, you can almost immediately tell where they're going to have problems with injuries, for example. So I had a classic example. This was a man who came to me a few months ago. He had a double fasciotomy, so on each shin, so on his in his anterior tibialis muscle, because the fascia in his anterior tibialis on both legs, it was just so tense, it was so tight that it just they needed to cut the fascia to relieve that tension. And he said it didn't really work. It worked for a little bit of time, and then it just all came back. And I mean, it was so obvious. I'll show you what was going on here. So as he was stepping forward, so I would get him just to do this exercise, just raise his arm, try and do this as reasonable posture, so step forward and back. As he was stepping forward, his whole shin would go, so his foot was pointing on an angle towards this way, and he'd lean into that front shin as he stepped forward. So it would be a lean in with the shin and then step back. It was quite something, and it was very, very obvious. So it didn't surprise me at all that he said he had problems in his shins. It's not always that obvious, but you often find things like this if you just simply do a very, very basic gait assessment. And so I didn't immediately say, did they check this before they actually did an operation on you? But it came maybe 2 or 3 sessions in where I said, so did they check your gait when they assessed you for why you were getting pain in that area and before an operation? And he said no. He'd been to numerous physios. He'd obviously been to a surgeon, so he'd been to doctors as well, and none of them assessed his gait. I find that just incredible. It's just an incredible ignorance of something that should be obvious, really. I mean, particularly as he was someone quite focused on working out, he was quite an active person. walking, running, these are the two of the most basic things you're going to do quite a lot of, particularly walking. And if every time you take a step, you're putting excess tension on a particular area of your body so obviously as he was, then it seems obvious to me that there's the cause of your problem, and trying to fix that problem is going to be a very important part of the solution, instead of getting the surgeon to sort out the problem overnight, which didn't work. Surprise, surprise. So, and this leads me into the general problem of arrogance. Now, I think this is particularly prevalent in biology and human biology and in the medical profession. We have a problem of medical professionals thinking that they can cure people, because there are certainly things like, for example, certain like vaccines, for example, do an incredible job of eradicating some viruses. Surgery does an incredible job of saving people's lives. We are extremely good at saving life. So in an emergency, it seems to be something that we're very good at. And then sorting out emergency problems. So if someone breaks a leg catastrophically in a car crash, we can stick plates and screws in the legs, and they can recover to some degree, depending on the break, but they can recover. Rather than in the past, if you were to just leave that shattered leg, I mean it's gone. There's no coming back from it. So we can do amazing things in the medical profession, and that has led to an arrogance to believe that they can sort a lot of perhaps more mundane things, more everyday things that occur in people's lives. And I think the maintenance of good general health is something that the medical profession do not do very well at all in almost every category, and it particularly is particularly relevant with biomechanical issues. And almost everyone will know someone who suffers from chronic pain, and it doesn't matter how many trips they go, how many trips to the physio they go, it never seems to go away, and they almost always end up eventually going under the surgeon's knife. And in some cases, some people are super lucky, they have a good surgery, comes out well, and then they die not too far in the distance before that joint surgery starts coming undone. But much better to keep your joints and to keep to be able to move freely and safely the way nature intended. Now, it's not to say that people living thousands of years ago would have better joint health than us. It's just a fact that they would have had different problems to deal with. We have more modern day problems to deal with, and we live a long time. So almost all of us are going to get joint health of some description. Some people are super lucky, they have great posture, they have great movement, almost naturally, their gait's fantastic. I came across someone the other day, a runner the other day, who had such a thing. It was extraordinary. Generally, when I see people run, it's a bit of a horror show of different little tweaks in their running styles and different problems, but he was bang on. But it's very, very rare. Most people are going to have joint issues, and that's going to really affect the quality of their life as they age. And we are hopeless. The medical profession is hopeless at addressing this when it comes to chronic pain in particular. And I do feel if they managed to address, if they knew how to get people moving properly, the way with good posture and with good movement efficiency, that they would also cure a lot of the acute injury problems that crop up, like knee ligament problems, for example, ankle ligament problems, bad backs, all sorts. And you can avoid even balance, even falls and things, because obviously if you have better posture, if you have better movement, and your balance is better, so you're less likely to fall over. It's something very relevant to older people who often, when they, for example, have a fall and break a hip, that pretty much a year or so later they're dead. And there's quite good literature on that after a fall, let's say people in a nursing home, after they have a fall and break their hip, in many cases it's only a year later and they're dead. because obviously they become inactive, and then that starts affecting their mental health. It starts affecting other physical health factors as well. So this is where there's a profound arrogance and ignorance in the medical community. We really need to start focusing on how to improve health. It's not really much good just making people live longer and those last few years of life be an absolute misery. We need to have better quality of life, and I'm not sure that the medical profession is focusing on that particularly well. So finally then, how do the medical profession do this? How can they begin to help people better? So obviously I'm just going to say, listen to what I'm saying, listen to what the people at Functional Patterns would say, for example, another company whose method of doing things I think is fantastic. But in general, I think it's very important for medical professionals, physios, exercise physiologists, doctors even more so, because I find I often go to the doctors these days and they're not particularly healthy folk. But they need to be able to walk the walk a little bit more. So it's no good, and I've said this in a blog before. It's no good, for example, if you want to lose weight, why would you go to a trainer that is not just overweight, but getting more overweight as they get older? Why would you go to a trainer who can't keep their own weight down? Now, there would be an argument for going to a trainer that is overweight who has lost a lot of weight in the last, say, year or two. That would make some sense. But it doesn't make sense to me to go to a trainer who's gaining weight as time goes by. So why would you go to a trainer who's getting injured as time goes by? Why would you go to a physio who isn't a prime specimen isn't a prime physical specimen? Why would you go to an exercise physiologist who has lots of health problems? There are some health problems that people can't help. I had varicose veins that were removed a few months ago. My mum and my dad had them. It's just genetic. There's nothing I could do about it. But some things like joint injuries, again, because it's a complicated subject, some people maybe they are more prone to joint injuries, but I think a lot of joint injuries is not that simple. It's not just a genetic thing, and there is something you can do about it. So why go to someone who's getting injured all the time? And I did find this a fair amount in my old job. I would find that particularly older, vulnerable clients would go to trainers who were having like knee surgery all the time, shoulder surgery. I just feel like, why are they going there? They want, and that these people even write on their blurb for promoting themselves that they were all about injury prevention and rehab, but they're getting injured all the time. I mean, it was bizarre. Now, the Greeks had this notion very, very well. So you'll often find quotations from Plato and ancient historians will tell you about this as well, that doctors, physicians, they were often the ones that were seen in the gym the most, because it helped them understand their bodies better, and if they understood their bodies better, they understood their patients' bodies much better. And the better they functioned, particularly, then the more they understood about what was the ideal in other people's bodies when they functioned as well. And so this happens all the time when I'm training people. I have to show people how to do the exercises. And that sounds pretty basic, doesn't it? But there's so much detail that needs to be put into this when you're dealing with people who have spent most of their lives in jobs that's putting themselves in a very unideal position, that have had injuries in the past that have changed the way they've moved. So there has to be great attention to detail, and it's not as simple as just saying, do this, do that, put yourself in this position. There are lots of problems that can be associated with changing your position, trying to change your posture. If you get it wrong, it can actually lead to other problems. And unless you've gone through this process yourself, it's very, very difficult to advise people and to train people in how to move properly unless you have either gone down that road and made the mistakes yourself, or done the training with someone to point out to you, look, if you change this person's movement in this way, what are the problems associated with the change? What kind of injury problems, what potential aches and pains are you going to lead them to if you don't do this in a careful and considered way? And what are some of the ways they're going to adapt to moving or being in different positions that could be bad for them? And I've made a lot of mistakes in this way. I'll give you a very quick example about depressed shoulders. For example, most people generally believe that you should put your shoulders back, and a lot of people also believe that you should put them down. Now, when you're doing the kinds of training that I'm doing a lot of swinging of weights, for example. If the shoulder is quite down in a depressed position, you're going to get a lot of strain here on the labrum of the shoulder, and also in the neck as well. You may also cause something called a thoracic outlet syndrome if those shoulders are too depressed. So that's just one simple factor that people can get into if you just tell them to, look, get your shoulders back in your posture. That would just be one very simple example. But you'll know by going through the training yourself, trying to go through the ranges of motion that you should be capable with, by putting yourself in the right postural positions, you'll know the problems that are going to be associated with this. You'll know the difficulties that your clients are going to have. You'll know exactly how much hard work it's going to take. And unfortunately, it does take a fair amount of hard work. And if the people in these professions, physios, exercise physiologists, doctors, if they knew more about the ideal of how to move and how to get there, then they'd be much better at advising their patients. At the moment, I'm afraid, and particularly in my dealings with physios and when I see them at work, I would say the majority of people who are coming with biomechanical issues, particularly chronic pain, it's simply a waste of money, and they're quite expensive in many cases, more expensive than me. They can demand much higher amounts of money than I can because they've got a piece of paper in their hand that says that they can do what they do. But again, only in those specific instances of acute injury, they're worth it. But in the vast majority of cases where I see them work, they're not worth it. And yeah, it sounds a controversial statement, I know, but I just can't. I've just had far too much experience with these people and what they do, and there's not enough attention to detail, I'm afraid, with the vast majority of people. So I hope that helps you. So in summary then, let's talking specifically about physios and exercise physiologists, that's when I would see them. A physio, when you've actually injured yourself acutely, you've had an accident or you've torn a tendon, broken a bone, something like that. That's what they're very, very good for. Anything that requires long-term maintenance of health, biomechanical health, absolutely not, unless they are kind of a special physio that knows other things other than just what they've trained. If they've trained in that regular manner, I would stay clear of them. And then exercise physiologists, I wouldn't go to an exercise physiologist in general. Again, there are obviously good ones that know their stuff, but in general, I wouldn't go to an exercise physiologist for biomechanical issues at all, whether they're acute or chronic. But things like diabetes, high blood pressure, heart problems, stroke issues, stuff like that, that's not a bad one to go to. Otherwise, you need to find some people that know what they're doing. If you do have chronic issues, find someone that knows how to move properly and can show you and do it themselves. And it doesn't matter what piece of paper they've got at the end of the day. If they can do that and they're either injury-free or on the improve when it comes to injury, that's a good person to see. Okay, well, that's Healthcast number 3. I hope you enjoyed that one, and I'll see you next time. Oh yeah, and don't forget to subscribe. More videos are coming, and hopefully more tutorial videos about how to get this stuff done. So I'll see you next time once again.